resources to learn new things, and the opportunity to network with experts and seek their help. Our goal with our webinars is to introduce our members to new frameworks and tools in the rapidly evolving tech landscape. And to do this, we bring top speakers in the world of tech. Today's webinar will focus on Spring Batch, and everyone knows, how critical batch processing is, and today's data-heavy workloads. And Spring Batch, provides reusable functions that enable, high-volume, high-performance batch jobs. And we will see in this webinar on how we can leverage this framework in a scalable manner to process large volumes of information. And excellent topic, really, that is of interest to any programmer, wherever they are in their programming journey. Everybody is expected to handle large workloads. So really, really interesting topic. And to handle this, to kind of make sense of this topic, we have a really, really excellent speaker. So we have Rodrigo Graciano. Rodrigo is a principal software engineer at BNY Mellon, and he has worked on a variety of projects using Java in areas as diverse as medical care, financial services, and logistics. Incidentally, all areas that sort of generate and process large volumes of data. Rodrigo is also the leader of the largest Java user group in North America, the New York Java SIG. And he is a popular conference speaker who enjoys good following on Twitter and other social media platforms. So do feel free to follow him on Twitter, where he is very active. Rodrigo, thanks for taking the time out to join us. It's a really great privilege to have you do this webinar for us today. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Gunnar. It's good evening, everyone. It's early morning for me. I'm in New York. Thanks for your time.
That's okay. Yeah, you could proceed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. And so today, as I said, as mentioned, we're going to be talking about Spring Batch. So let me share my screen here and we can get started. I'm going to share this screen here. All right. Let's see if you can see well.
Yes, we can. Yes,
all right. Okay. So I'm gonna quick jump into the slide. We have a couple of things, a bunch of things to cover. So let's get started. So a lot of people ask, what is a Spring Batch? So I don't know how many of you have used Spring Batch. So I think it's just important to define what Spring Batch is and what Spring Batch is not. Okay. So the definition of Spring Batch is excellent. That is of interest to any programmer. All right. So the Spring Batch is you can think as a lightweight framework. Okay, that's used to process a finite amount of data. Okay. I think that's important. Although during the presentation we will see that's not only used for a finite number of data. I think it's important to have this differentiation, and I think Spring Batch works best when you're working with a finite number of data. All right. Another thing, I think that's important. It's what Spring Batch is not. So Spring Batch is not a scheduler. So if you're looking for something else, something that works as a scheduler, Spring Batch is not your tool. So you're gonna find other tools like, I don't know, ESP, Control-M, Chrome, Job Runner. There's a couple other things, but Spring Batch is not a scheduler. It can be used with these tools that I mentioned, but ESP, Spring Batch is not a scheduler. Okay, quick introduction. So my name is Rodrigo Graciano. I'm principal software engineer in a financial institution in New York. And as mentioned, I'm one of the leaders of the New York Java SIG, was the first Java user group created. 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I was nominated a Java champion. So that's pretty new. And this is my blog, Graciano Dev. Every week, I post an article with Java JVM related content, and this is my Twitter at Rodrigo Graciano. Feel free to follow me to interact, ask questions. Right. So let's jump in. We're gonna keep on the time. All right, the basics. So during this presentation, a lot of words I expect to be that you're gonna be familiar with, the words that we're gonna use, like job, repository, files, validations, right? And a couple of them we're gonna see it might be different for you, or you're gonna have a different meaning when we're talking about Spring Batch. Okay, so the bit we're gonna cover now: what is a job, what is a step, a repository, and how do we run a Spring Batch application. Okay, so the basic architecture of Spring Batch. So Spring Batch, so you have a launcher that's going to execute a job. Okay, a job can have one or multiple steps. Okay, but one job is always what we're going to run, and a step will be it can have multiple steps, but at least one. It needs to have at least one. Sorry, I have a bad coffee. And a step, we're going to see that it can have a reader and a writer. It must have a reader and a writer. Okay, when we're using a checklist step that we're going to see later, and a processor, which is optional. Okay, and all of those steps, they are in link with the job repository. And that's important because the job repository is where we're going to keep a track of the status of our jobs. If we need to retry our jobs, if we want to see, our message about our job, how many records were processed, read, written. So all those information are going to be on the job repository. Okay, so a step, as I mentioned, we're gonna have inside a step a reader and a writer. Those two are mandatory, with a process in the middle. Okay, and the process is going to be optional. The process, we will see more details about it later, but the goal is where we're going to add validations or business rules. Okay, so let's show some code. I think everybody or most of the people here are a programmer, so let's see some code. Is the font size good enough? If you can see the source code well.
Sorry, I was talking on mute. Yeah, I think it's good enough. Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, so here I'm defining a batch application. And let me just say, yesterday I updated this project to use the last version of Spring Batch, which is 5.0. The Spring Batch 5.0, there were a couple changes that happened, but it's only worked with Java 17 plus and with the new Spring Boot 5 as well. Okay, so let's just go through the POM quickly. So this is a Spring Batch application, a Spring Boot application. Sorry, Spring Boot application. Sorry, the boot is 3. The version is 3, not 5. 5 is the batch, and uses Spring Batch here. Have a lab. An important thing here is I have a H2 embedded database. Okay, those are the important things here on the POM. Our job, this is our first job that will be seen. It's going to be very simple. We're going to read from a file and we're going to write to a file. Okay, so the file we're going to read, race results, with a very simple file. Okay, has the race results, Formula 1 race results, and has position and the driver. Only the top 10. Okay, that's very simple. So what we're trying to do is to read this file and write another file. exactly the same. We're not doing anything new, right? So let's identify now the components on Spring Batch. So here is our job definition. Okay, now on the version until version 4 from Spring Batch, we would use a job builder factory, but now they were deprecated, so we're using a job builder. And now also we need to pass a job repository. So the job repository is gonna be, as we are defining in our properties file, the H2 database. Spring Batch will create this job repository for us using that data, because it's able to identify a data source. Spring Boot will create this data source, and the job repository will be used using this data source. Okay, so we have here a job repository that we're passing to the job builder. We're saying that the job name is simple job and passing this job repository. And we're saying start this step. Remember I mentioned we need to have at least one step. And here we're defining the step. Two things we need here on the step that we didn't need on Java 4, on Spring Batch 4, is the job repository again. And we also need to pass the transaction manager that we're using. Okay, so as we have the H2, it's going to generate this platform transaction manager, which we are injecting here in this bin. So we are saying that our step, the name is simple step, and we pass the repository. We're going to process one record at a time using this transaction manager. And we also defining our reader and our writer. As I mentioned, the processor is optional. The reader and the writer are mandatory. Okay. So what we're doing here, we're using this flat file item reader, which is provided by Spring Batch. So no need to reinvent the wheel here, and for you to be manually working with Java.io or Java.io. You can just use what Spring Batch provides to you. There's many things out of the box that Spring Batch is going to provide. So we're saying here that we're going to return a flat file item reader. We have this builder here. We have a field set. Field set is the easiest way to work with Spring Batch. It's just going to map to a map. Whatever you're reading is going to put on a map. Or I'm passing here which resource I'm reading. I'm saying that's a CSV file and it's delimited. If the delimiter was different, we could define here if it was a pipe or whatever. So we could put here. We're also saying, so now is a little bit of the magic that on Spring Boot. So we're using this field set mapper, and we're saying that we're using the names are position and pilot, and this is how it's going to be mapped internally to Spring Batch. So Spring Batch is going to read this and it's going to create this field set with two IDs, a position and a pilot, and it's going to create this and it's going to pass to the next process, which is going to be the writer. So the writer is going to receive this field set. We're using the same flat file just to keep things simple. So we're using a flat file writer now. So we're doing the builder. We're saying that we're writing the field set. I'm just writing here to, in the same place in my project, or say that I want to write a delimited file. Okay, and the extractor, this pass-through field extractor is Spring Batch doing the magic of just, you don't need to map yourself to, I don't know, a DTO, a record, or a class. Okay, it's just gonna know how to extract the data from there. The way I'm running this here, I've just created, so this, as I said, is a Spring Boot application. So we're just nothing different here. Okay. Up to Spring Batch 4, you would need to have enable batch processing application, okay, to run batch jobs, because that would give you a lot of bins out of the box for your application, like the factories, the job builder factory, the job step builder factory, job builder factory. It would give the job repository. It would give you a lot of things out of the box. Starting on batch 5, if you add this annotation, it's going to have the opposite behavior. Okay, it's not going to generate, it's going to understand that you want to define them yourself. So if you want to let Spring Boot, Spring Batch create those beans that are required for you, you don't need this application. You should not use it. Okay. All right. So remove here. So I'm just starting the application, and I'm just I just created different profiles for each job we're going to be running. So here I'm running with the profile simple. And if you go here to the batch, we have here profile simple. So it's going to identify all those beans. All right, so let's run this job. It's a very small file, as I show you, but you can see the H2 console is started, it's running. So here, the job, simple job, launched, executing simple step, executed in 38 seconds, and the job, simple job, was completed in 54 milliseconds. Okay. And where it's going to be here, let me just refresh. Where is my results here? We just created a file like the one we read. Okay, so this new file, position and driver. So it's, as you see, it's very simple use case, but show how to read CSV files and how to write to CSV files, which few lines of codes. Okay, something important. Let me go here. Let me reload that. I'm gonna be offline now. Okay, so we're gonna. Oh, we didn't write anything to the database, but what I wanted to show you here in the database is one important table. So Spring Batch, as I mentioned before, it has the job, it has the repository where a bunch of information about what we're doing is going to be persisted. So you can see there's the job execution, the context, parameters, and for the step. But let's look at the step. The step has more interesting information. So if we look here in the step, we're going to see the step execution. So these tables here, Spring Batch need those tables to run, okay? So we're saying step execution, ID 1, time that was created, started, and the status that ended. Commit count 11. Important parts here, the read count. So it said that it read 10 files. It did not filter any file, any record out, and it wrote 10 items. So read 10, filter 0, wrote 10 items. Okay, so all these informations are gonna be here on the W2, on those tables that Spring Batch uses, right? Okay, let me go back here. IntelliJ, we don't need that for now. Don't need to. Okay. So as I said, that's annotation that enable batch processing until Spring Batch 4. It would give you all those beans: the job repository, the job launcher, the registry explorer, the platform transaction manager, the job builder factory, step builder factory. All those things would be given to you by this annotation. But starting on 5, when you add this annotation, Spring Batch understands, hey, our developer does not want to use all those beans. He's gonna create the beans by himself. Okay? So I recommend just let Spring Boot, Spring Batch create the beans itself. So remove this annotation. If you're migrating to 5, remove this annotation. It's also important to see that the job builder factory and the step builder factory that were used to create our jobs and steps before they were deprecated, not removed yet, but they were deprecated, and we should use the job builder and step builder. A little bit more. See, the job repository, as we saw, has all those tables that he needs to work with, where is we're going to keep track of the jobs and give you other things like restartability. If your job fail, that's where the Spring Batch will look at to see what failed, where it needs to restart. Okay, so the reader and the writer that we saw before, they were the flat file. Okay, but out of the box, Spring Batch gives you a bunch of different things that you can use. So database, you can connect via JDBC, you can connect with MongoDB, Neo4j, Hibernate, bunch of different things. Flat files, you can work with delimited flat files like we saw. It can be fixed length, you can have different delimiters. We will work with XML, JSON. It works with multi-file. So suppose you receive like, I don't know, 100 files that they have exactly the same format. Okay. So the multi-file is a smart way to process all those together instead of having to, I don't know, to execute a step 100 times or having 100 steps in this case to perform. The multi-file is just a smart way that you can, if the files have the same format, you can process them together, okay, within one single step. Another thing, there's also readers for JMS, Kafka, AMQP, but as I mentioned before, I don't think that's the best use case for Spring Batch. Okay, I think it's when you have a finite amount of data is the best use case for Spring Batch. And writers, similarly, we have all those writers out of the box for us, so we don't need to be reinventing the wheel and creating new things. So we have things to work in the database, files, blah, blah, as we said before. The processors, as I quickly mentioned, the processor is where we're going to be filtering and adding validation. We can be also transforming the data, and depending on your use case, sometimes you're going to even fetch more data. So that's the goal with the processor. Just think that where you're going to add your business logic is the processor. Okay, and it's optional. Again, it's optional if you have a chunklet step like the one we saw before. We're going to have mandatory the reader and the writer, but the processor is optional. The multi-file reader that I mentioned before. So we can read multiple files in a single step as long as they have the same format. Okay, and it works with XML, JSON, and flat files. Right. So let's just see how that work. So we're gonna do something similar here. So let's get here multi-file, right? So similar things. I'm just saying that the class path is everything that starts with race star. So we're gonna see we have Chiu in this time we have Chiu, so it's both has 10 the first 10 drivers of a race. So you see in this one, the first one was Max Verstappen, and in this other one was Charles Leclerc. So we have 10 on race results 1 and 10 on race results 2. All right, so if we're using what we see before, we would need to have 2 steps, or maybe run multiple times. But using the multi-file, we're gonna see how it's gonna work. So we're gonna read everything that starts with race star. The job is the same as we saw before, very similar. But we're just saying that the name is the multi-file job. The step is the multi-file step. And here, the only difference, let's see, is gonna here we're defining a multi-resource item reader builder. Okay, and this guy, this guy is smart enough to get all those files that's going to receive and process one by one. But it's not good. He's not going to execute the job itself, right? So he's going to delegate the job to another writer, which is our friend flat file item reader that we saw before. It's the same thing as before, same reader that we saw before. But in this case, this guy's multi-resource item reader is going to be like a wrapper, and it's going to delegate the job to the race file. Another thing that we're seeing here differently, I'm saying that my field set mapper is a record field set mapper. Okay, and I'm using the record race. So if we see the race is just a Java record race, the constructor here. I don't know how much familiar you are with records. So records are final. We don't need to define getters and setters, constructors, and a bunch of equals, hash code to string. All of this is going to be generated for you, just like what Lombok pretty much was doing. But that's record. So we have this race record defined here. And as we pass in position and pilot, it's going to look for those properties on the record, position, and file to map. And that's done automatically by Spring Boot. So position and pilot. And when it goes, oops, come on, it goes there, it's going to be able to do. Right. And the writer now, instead of using the flat file writer, we're using a JDBC batch item writer. So now we're going to write to our database. And see a few lines of code here. We're saying that here's our query. And you say that you're passing a bean property, item SQL parameter source provider. We're saying here that it's going to extract from the race. All right. So that's our model. Okay, so it's pretty much it's gonna use the race that's gonna receive, and it's gonna look for the position and pilot and to write. So gonna here to multi-file. If we run this guy, see how we run time, 8 o'clock, okay. All right, so job, multi-file job, multi-file step, and completed in 61 milliseconds. Okay, so now if we go back to the H2, where's our H2? I probably killed that, right? Okay. I'm gonna have here the writer. Well, here the championship. See, we have the 20 records now. The first 10, the one starts with Charles Leclerc, and the next 10, the first one he starts with Max Verstappen. So 2 lines of code. We read from the data boot from the file. We read multiple file, and we wrote to the database. So we can also look at the step. It's going to have here 20 items were read, 20 items were written. Okay, so very, very simple to do with Spring Batch. As again, a few lines of code, and we're able to create this. All right. Come, let's keep moving. Right. So we're gonna see now that other thing that Spring Batch provides out of the box for us: tasklets, chunks, and let's identify why it's a good idea to use chunks, and the different types of listeners that Spring Batch provides to us. That's gonna help us. All of those items are important when defining our jobs. A tasklet, as I mentioned before, I was always saying the chunklet step, where we have a reader and a writer and maybe a processor. Okay, but what if we need to perform some action that are not a read action or not a write action? Suppose you receive your files their zip, or you need to download the files, I don't know, from S3 to your local repository to running them, or you need to truncate your database. So when you need to do this one-time tasks, you're going to use a tasklet. So a tasklet is a special type of a step where you're not going to have a reader and a writer, but you're going to have something that you're going to execute one time. So it's where you're going to be able to do all of those things here, or anything else that depends on your business. Okay, the chunk. It's important that what we were seeing here, we would like read one item, write one item, read one item, write one item. Hey, and we're working with pretty small files here, 10 records, so that's not really a big deal. But once we start working with a very heavy process, or a large amount of data, suppose you have, I don't know, millions of records, hundreds of thousands of records, then that might not be the best case, because our transaction is committed when we write, okay? And if we are reading one item and writing one item, write one item, that's very costly, because we are creating a transaction for every single item. So we can define with Spring Batch the size of our transaction, let's say our chunk. So how many items we're going to process at a time before we commit this transaction. Okay. So instead of read, process, write, we're going to like read, then we process, and then we write. Okay. So depending on the number that we define in our chunk, we're going to read this. So suppose the chunk size is 100. So we're going to read 100 records. We're going to process around 100 records, and we're going to pass 100 records to the writer. And that's going to be within a single transaction. Okay. Listeners, there's many listeners out of the box as well that Spring Batch provides to us for the job execution. So we're going to, before and after a job starts, before and after a step runs, for each item that we read, we write, for our chunk size, for the items that we process, and records that we skip. Okay. So for example, why to use a listener? So suppose when your job ends, if you had any error, you want to send a notification. Okay, so you're going to create this, you can create this listener. So suppose a simple job listeners, and you're gonna have to override these two methods to implement these two methods before job and after job. So you can pretty much add your business logic and say, oh, okay, if my batch status is fail, I don't know, do some action, send an alert, send an email, whatever. It's a business requirement. Okay? And also, one thing that you can do, you don't need to say for every one of your job, oh, I implemented simple job, I implemented simple job. Suppose you have multiple listeners, right? So you don't need to repeat that every single time. So what you can say, you can have one abstract job that has all those listeners, and you can say that this job is your parent job. And then you're going to inherit all these functionalities. For step, so we have those before and after step. We have for the item read. So for each item that we read, before we read, after we read, and when an error happens, we have listeners for that. The same for reading elements. For our chunk size, for items that we process, and records that we skip. We're going to see more about it in a few minutes. Okay, so let's take a look more on code and look at chunks and listeners. And all right. All right. Okay, so this job again is simple, nothing different here, but the listener. Okay, so we're adding a listener to our job. we're going to see. And this listener we are adding is this tour job competition notification. So we see this listener implements the job execution listener. And what it does is after the job completes, it's going to check if the status is completed. It's going to log a warn. It's going to run a query. And for each record it finds, it's just going to print here on the log. Okay. That's it. It's not useful, but it's just to show what you can do with listeners. All right. So, where is tool processor job? Our step now, we have a 10. So instead of reading one by one, it means that we're going to read 10, process 10, and write 10. We are also adding a processor now. So we have a reader, a processor, and a writer. Okay, so our reader, now we're going to read again from a file, but the file is slightly different. So we have a tool position file. So it has position, name of the athlete, the team, and the time it completed. So it has 135 records here. So we're going to read position, name, team, and times. And again, we're going to use a record field set mapper. We're going to map this to the writer, which is also a record. So writer, position, name, team, times. Position, name, team, times. So they match here. We're going to have the processor, which is a writer item processor. Let's identify the item write processor. Is just what it's doing. It's just returning a writer, same position, and it's uppercase in the name, and that's it. Okay. Important thing here on the writer, on the processor, sorry, if we want to filter out anything, we have any business logic here. The way it works, if you return the object, you see that you have a writer here. The method is going to be the same. So we are saying that we receive a writer, and we're gonna return a writer. You can have different things here, so you can transform to other objects here as well. But going back to filter, the way you do it, you return no. Okay. So if you have any business case, so you say, I don't know, if writer dot team equals, I don't know, team A, you can say return no. Okay. So if you return no, this record is going to be removed and not going to be passed forward to the writer. That's how we use the processor to filter records. Okay. So in this case, we're just making uppercase. And we're gonna write to the database using the JDBC item writer that we saw before, the table writer. Okay, so expect to see 135 records into the tour. Okay, 13. We're gonna see a bunch of things here. Let's just show a little bit. So you see that the job started. The processor was logging every information, right? That we passed out. Okay, and that's how it was. And I'm gonna processor after it says writer job finish it. Time to verify the results, and now we are seeing that all the names are uppercase. Okay, so we went to the database. Here's position 1 and did that for every single one that was persisted. So we see 135 items were persisted here. Now, if we want to see that, we can go 82 connect. We're gonna see that on the writer. We have here 135 uppercase. 135 here. And we're gonna also see, oops, if we go to the step execution table, we're gonna see that we have 135 items read, 135 written, and the commit count was 14. So I think that it was doing it in batches of 10. The commit count is always going to be more than it's needed, and that depends how Spring Batch is keeping track. So when it started, when it finished it, for each chunk, it's going to create a different commit. But if we were doing one by one, we would probably see like 140 commits here. But we're seeing only 14, which is good and helps our performance. Okay. All right. So, but let's talk a little bit about errors, right? So what happens if our application has an error? How do you restart? How do you skip failures? How do you retry? So those things also are provided by Spring Batch, many of those things, because as we know, no batch, no job, no functionality is error prone. Okay, so there are useful things here that Spring Batch provides. So start limit. So this for a step, we can say that a step can restart up to a certain number of times. Okay, so suppose it fail, we can try to run it again, but we can say, oh, the limit is X, is 1, is 2, is 5. Allow start if complete, it's a boolean true or false. By default, so suppose a job has 5 steps. By default, if a job fails, when you try to run that job again, it's not gonna run the steps that are already completed. It's gonna resume from the steps that fail. So we have 3 steps. The second one failed, the first one completed. It's gonna, when you restart the job, it's gonna start from the second one. If the first one is something that you always need to run, then you must annotate that step with allow start with completed true and say what's the limit, how many times you're going to let this step restart. Okay. When we have errors in audience that we're reading, processing, or writing, the way that we work around this, by default, Spring Batch was just gonna fail. Okay? That's the default use case. Spring Batch is gonna fail. So you can annotate your step as fault tolerance, and you can say that you're gonna skip some exceptions. So suppose I don't know, you have some exception that if they happen, you want to skip, right, that record. And you can say, oh, skip for that given exception. That can go as high as exception class. I don't think that's a good case, but it can go as high as that. And you can say how many times you are okay to skip. So if you have, I don't know, 10 records, you are okay to skip. You're gonna annotate this skip limit with 10. So until this time is gonna be fine. After on the 11th, it's gonna fail. You can also say never skip to a given exception, and do not roll back for some exception. Okay. And the same way you can say that this step you can retry for some exception and a retry limit. So suppose, I don't know, in your code you are just calling some REST service, and I don't know, the service is unavailable. So you have a custom exception that you can say, okay, retry for this and to a certain amount of times. Okay. So let's go back here. So we're seeing that the tool processor. So we have here so let's do one thing before. So we're seeing that this tool position was just giving errors, right? So let's see. It worked fine, but now let's remove the position, which is mandatory in our database. Okay, so now if we try now to run this job, okay, the job failed. Okay, it said null is not allowed for the column position. And here it said the step, the job completed, parameters, status fail. Okay. So it did not process our files, right? So how can we fix that? Is like what we were seeing. So we have defined here a fault tolerant job. The job builder is the same. So this is pretty much like the tool processor that we were seeing. Let's see what are the differences here. All right. So here we have defined that this step is fault tolerant, that we are okay to skip any type of exception up to 12 times. And we are okay to restart this, to retry up to 2 times the job. We're also adding a listener here, a skip listener. So every item that fails on the read, on the write, on the process, it's going to skip in this case, right? Because we are seeing here, so an error is going to skip up to 12 times. And we're just logging this error. I'll skip, error when reading, error when writing, error when processing. Okay? So that's the difference here. We're adding fault tolerant, we're adding the skip, the retry, and we're adding this new listener. Okay? Let me show. So, but now we're gonna read this other file here, the tool position with errors. And there's a couple of errors on this file here. Not all the columns are here. We have records, you're going to see here, without position. There are some missing commas in the middle of all those files. So we expect to see a couple errors here. And when we run this guy, oops, okay. Here we go. We're going to see that the job ran fine. And a couple of records were skipped. So line 10, for example, was skipped. Line 20, 21. So other records were skipped. The last one probably was skipped as well. Yeah, here, error writing, because there is no position. But the job completed. Even with all the errors, the job completed. Success states. Okay, and now if we go back up to 82, and we had, let's just show, we had 136 records this time. Yeah, 136 records this time. And if we go now to our right table, we're gonna see a position 1 to 3 of the 10 skip, 20 to 30 is skipped, and the last one that did have the position is not here as well. Okay, so we have 135, the last one was 135, so we inserted 124, so we have 136, yeah, 136, and those how many were left. And if we go here to the batch step execution, now we're gonna see more details about it. So we're saying that we read 125 records. We wrote 124. 11 items were skipped when reading. 1 item, 1 record was skipped when writing. So all this information, and 3 times it was rolled back. Okay, so what Spring Batch will do in this case? You see that this number is a little bit high. So we're saying that our let's see, our tool processor fault tolerant job, our what is our chunk size? Chunk size 100. So it read 100 and it was writing 100, and it fails, it roll back and try again to process. Okay, so that's how we can get away with errors on Spring Batch. Okay, so retry, skip, all those things are useful when you're writing, when you're defining your job. Right. We have 5 more minutes, so let me run here. Step flow and scale and parallel processing. So we saw that one job has all those examples that we saw. The job has one step, but we can have multiple steps in our job. So suppose step 1 is going to be a tasklet that truncates the data, a given table. Step 2 is going to read from a file, write to the database. Step 3 is going to read from the database and write to another table. Those supposed to have multiple steps. And by default, Spring Batch will create the jobs, the steps are going to be processed sequentially. Okay, so we're going to process step 1 when it's done, so step 2 when it's done, step 3. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, but that's not the only way. Okay, we can have it conditionally based on the exit status, or we can also use a decider to define how to process our jobs. So we can pretty much at the condition say, okay, step 1 is running, and if depending on the something on the status on step 1, or depending on some other condition, you can say now run step 2 or run step 3. So you're never going to run step 2 and 3 in the same job. You're going to run one or the other. So you can add this kind of business logic. You can also have a split. Okay, a split is going to say, if you have a step that can run in parallel, but and is not going to impact anything that you're doing, you can say run this step in parallel. So you can say start step 1, after step 1 completes, go to step 2, and while this is going, trigger it starts on another thread, step 3, and when they all complete, you can run step 4. So you can split your process like this. Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, and when we want to, if we need to scale more our process, we can easily define there's different techniques to do that. So you can easily define a thread pool executor and pass to your step. So I can say, oh, create this thread pool with 4 threads and use on this step. So you can make the step multi-threaded. You can have the parallel steps like we saw. And also you have remote chunking and remote partitioning, where you're gonna like use manager and workers to process the data. Okay, remote chunking, the data, you pass the data to the workers, a reference to the data, and the remote partitioning, the data is local, so we actually passing the data to the wire. Those are different techniques when there's a lot of process included, so you can pretty much split that and have it running parallel. So you can split the load between multiple workers. Okay. 2 minutes left. Okay, I'm just gonna leave this here, where you're gonna find the stack and where you're gonna find the source code for this. I can copy and send to you as well. You can send to everyone. I can do that. I can put here on the chat. I can keep this to you and send here on the chat. Let's see. And then you can send to the audience as batch. Oh, come on. There we go. And the repository with all the codes. There you go. Okay, so that was just migrated, as I said, to Spring Batch 5. Wait, I don't know if it's still GA or it's final, but it was just released to, just migrated to Spring Batch 5. I know we're over the time. I don't know if you have any questions.
Perfect. So thanks, Rodrigo. I see that you're not really well, but thanks for taking the time and then doing this session for us. Really, really interesting. To see, for the first time, I think one of the things that struck me is it's very expressive, right? I mean, you don't have to write too many lines of code, and what I've also seen is that it also beginner friendly, so it's not hard for somebody to kind of pick it up and then start using. So thanks a lot for taking us through that, and we really enjoyed that part where you showed us how to build that in a fault tolerant manner, how to skip past errors, because those kind of keep happening with large data sets. Inevitably you run into an issue. So that part was really interesting. So I would encourage people on this call to kind of reach out to you for questions, but otherwise I'll have these links shared with them.
Perfect.
And also do follow Rodrigo Graciano at RODRIGO GRACIANO. So he's on Twitter. So any questions you could reach out to him there.
Perfect. And here on my repository, there is another repository here, the Cloud Batch, where there are many examples of the scaling and parallel process. So all those items are there. So if you want to take a look, it's a Cloud Batch repository on my GitHub.
Got it.
Perfect. All right.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you very much.
So thanks a lot for doing this, Rodrigo, and I wish you a good day ahead.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.